I'll introduce myself briefly. So I'm Milan. I'm a senior product manager here at Semgrep. I'm responsible for our code product, our SAST product, and our secrets product, our product that helps you detect secrets. But it's not going to really be about me today. I'm mostly here to talk to Holden about his recent work with Semgrep and what all the amazing work he's been doing to help add more Elixir coverage into Semgrep. And with that, Holden, I'll let you take it away to introduce yourself.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here today and chatting with everyone here. As you mentioned, my name's Holden Oullette. I'm currently a staff application security engineer at Okta, which is quite the mouthful. But before that, I was a security architect at a late stage startup called Podium, and they were kind of quietly one of the largest Elixir shops around. So that was something that yeah, so Elixir is near and dear to my heart, and I'm very excited to be able to continue to work on it to this day.
Amazing. Great. Well, with that, I'll give a quick run of house for what we'll be going over today. So we've done our introductions. Today, Holden will be sharing with us some of his insights on the application security industry as a whole from his years of experience at multiple different companies, and then give his take on what a practitioner view is into what Semgrep looks like, how do you use Semgrep on the day-to-day, and the pros and cons of it. He'll also talk about his experience maintaining Sobelow, the open source Elixir SaaS tool. We'll talk all about it and what it's like to maintain an open source project. And lastly, but most importantly, we'll give a big reveal for our Elixir coverage announcement of all the new work that Holden's been doing to add more Elixir support into Semgrep. And we'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for any questions you all have for me or for Holden. Cool. I'll take a quick pause. I see Chris also dropped a question in the chat. I'm curious if people use Elixir in their code bases, how many folks. So yeah, please engage with us and ask any questions. But with that, I'll keep this going. So Holden, question number one for you. What do you think are the biggest challenges in AppSec today? How do you see the field evolving in the future?
Yeah, definitely starting off with the real meaty questions here.
Yeah.
No, I think for folks who are familiar with sort of the software development lifecycle, I think that it's sort of no secret that one of the hardest areas to target and sort of enact substantive security change is like furthest left in the software development lifecycle, right? So that's to say like the ideation or the planning stages of development. There's been a number of times in my career that, a product feature is maybe about to ship that, while secure from a code or build perspective, may just be, inherently insecure in its design, or it may pose a risk to, whomever it's releasing to or something. And so not only is that like an incredibly difficult battle to sort of get things changed internally, just because folks have poured dozens and dozens of hours into like building something, but also like it starts to weigh on the security team and kind of makes us out to look like the bad guys for coming in, super late and being like, hey, we can't do that. So I think it's one of the hardest things in my opinion to really get changed. Now, like I think as far as the future goes, as the field is sort of changing, I think we've already seen a shift in the last couple decades or so with the advent of cloud computing and stuff, abstracting
Mm,
away a lot of the a lot of the problems that were previously associated with cybersecurity. Now, I should caveat that they're not gone. They're just sort of we think about them a little differently, right? And especially in today's sort of SaaS-driven world, right? We have to think about different security challenges as it pertains to application security. And so I think as time goes on, we and technology progresses, the abstractions will continue to change, and so too will sort of the necessity to understand how a system is built and the corresponding sort of mechanisms to break them and how to protect them. So, I'll spare everyone the sort of the diatribe about how AI is going to change everything, but I mean, it kind of will. I mean, it is an example, and so of it's just an example of how things are going to change, right? And we need to adapt and change um, to accommodate them. And so I think in that particular example, the field is changing so rapidly that we're still figuring out
yeah.
exactly what needs to happen. But like building around processes and tools that can accommodate that change especially at the same pace, I think is really necessary as the field sort of continues to evolve.
Yeah, those are great insights. The field is moving quickly. We've got the rise of SaaS, like you mentioned, the rise of AI, which is entirely new. Security teams really have a big challenge trying to keep up with that pace of innovation because the industry is not going to stop. Like we're not going to stop innovating on top of AI. We're not going to really pivot away from SaaS as a service. So I think that's a great point. We just have to try to figure out how to keep up with that pace of innovation and make sure that we're trying to get things, earlier in the process so that way it's easier to make those changes. That's a great insight. My second question for you regarding the AppSec industry. So, of all the security challenges that you're seeing in this space, which ones do you think are particularly important to the Elixir community? What do you think are some of the unique challenges that they face?
Yeah, I think that so far when I've been working with, Elixir code bases and such, like I come from a very lucky position. Like Elixir as a language is, uh, I would say, pretty secure. It is relatively difficult to like make something insecure from the get-go. I think the language itself does a really great job at like encouraging best practices from the get-go. And that's sort of, I think that's probably where a lot of my opinion on some of the biggest challenges come from, is just like, yeah, like how do you got to tackle it from the furthest left, because there's a lot you can already leverage in the Elixir language to make it secure. Um, but I think like beyond that, right? Like there are known bad patterns in Elixir that, the kind of the gotchas that I think it's important to look out for, and that's where I think tools like Semgrep or Sobelow can come in handy. But I don't want to get ahead of myself here.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think the best thing I think for everyone is really if you can start with a more secure language. That's the best thing. I think that's where we all kind of see the industry starting to go is thinking about not programming languages only from a speed of development, but a security of development as well. And I think Elixir is a fantastic example of that. But there are still, like you mentioned, especially for new folks to a language or new folks to a company, there are still gotchas that you can mess up on. Even experienced people, sometimes, when you forget something. And so having some tooling in place can help you kind of just give you that nudge so that you don't keep making that mistake. That's a great point. And then for other folks, some folks in the call may be new to AppSec as a whole or new to security for Elixir. What resources or tools would you recommend to someone who's interested in learning about the field of application security? How would you recommend they get started?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think for application security specifically, I personally believe that sort of it always helps to have a good understanding of how products are built and sort of empathizing with developers and the development lifecycle. And I'm talking about like really understanding the code base, the build processes, like deployment pipelines, like all that kind of stuff. And I think once you understand how a product is or a system is built, you just have to kind of combine it with all the ways that it can be broken, and then you use that to start to tackle application security. So, I mean, with that sort of potential oversimplification of AppSec aside, I think some more practical advice about sort of getting into AppSec is to really dig deep on OWASP vulnerabilities and sort of risk mitigation strategies that they've sort of outlined. I think like the open source model personally is like one that I identify with a lot, and I think the collective knowledge is usually better than the singular. And so I think a lot of the folks I talk to who are just starting out, tend to think of AppSec initially as just sort of just pen testing, which, while that's definitely an aspect of AppSec, I think it's just a component. And I think more often than not, it also needs to be implementing automated tooling or internal procedures or other processes to sort of detect vulnerabilities and to quickly rectifying them when they inevitably show their face. So.
Yeah, I think that's great. Starting with the basics, if you're in a technology focused organization, you probably have some engineers to go talk to figure out, what are their biggest problems, what's their setup look like, what does their software development process look like? I think that's a really great recommendation for a first step. And otherwise, obviously, I'm also personally a big open source fan. So yeah, looking at open source tooling, get yourself introduced into the community. There's just, I mean, folks at Semgrep working with Sobelow, many other like incredible open source communities are out there that you can become a part of. And there's a lot of friendly faces who will help you get introduced into the AppSec community. Cool. Well, with that, let's dive into Semgrep. So I'm curious your take. You've used Semgrep in a number of different roles now. What's your experience with Semgrep as an AppSec professional? What's your take on it?
Yeah, I love Semgrep, honestly. Like I was a huge proponent of it like way
We didn't
back.
pay you to say that.
No,
There's
no,
no
not
way.
at all.
We didn't pay him. We promise.
Yeah, no, I actually first discovered Semgrep when I was at DEF CON quite a few years ago. I saw it in an AppSec Village talk, and I was like, wow, this is just like this is awesome. And like as I sort of mentioned, like at Podium we used Elixir, and they still use Elixir, but they also use other languages too, right? Like um, we have a React front end, and there are other small Ruby things elsewhere. And so it's just like, okay, well, how do we approach this from as an AppSec professional? Like, how do I approach securing our code base from like a holistic perspective? And so when I heard about Semgrep, I was like, this is amazing, right? And how like it establishes a common base for us to approach just AppSec without having to like implement specialty tools for each language. And so that was really where it started. But obviously at the time, it didn't support Elixir, and so I was like, oh, like that's like the one bummer. Like this would be perfect.
Yeah.
But I really appreciated like Semgrep's approach to open source, and so it actually allowed an internal team at Podium to sort of start to try and make a fork of Semgrep to support Elixir, and so that was a fun experience. But like it just that's actually how I first started connecting with you guys, just like being able to connect from the open source perspective, and I think that was really cool. So.
Yeah, that's great. Again, big open source fans, and that's great to hear that I didn't realize you heard about us DEF CON. That's really cool.
Mhm.
Well, I guess so in your day-to-day now, or at any of your previous roles, what do you feel like is a thing that is most valuable about Semgrep? You mentioned language support, the open source community. What do you feel like is one of the things that makes you stick with Semgrep over time?
Yeah. I think it really is that sort of the language support, but also like from a pretty like philosophical level of application security and implementing a AppSec program, especially at a smaller company, being able to establish the sort of standards for our team and from a very like approachable way. Folks aren't already aware on this call, like SimGrep rules are very easy to work with YAML declarations and such, and that just is the tip of the iceberg. And so being able to say like, hey, you don't have to learn like a specific like you know domain specific language or something to support this tool, and we can also enact like actual security checks and changes, while also like I guess improving the developer experience, with the comments, the GitHub comments and such, and just being able to provide like rapid feedback to developers, I think is what really kept me around, and being able to like lean into that pretty heavily. So
Yeah, that's great. I think for me, the main hope that I have with SemGrep, especially with SemGrep Code, our SAST tool, is being able to do that where developers can really get involved and feel like they're bought into the security experience. I feel like in our conversations with people, sometimes there can be a lot of friction there, and I think SemGrep can be a great way to start to repair that relationship through like the PR comments, other just like things that really try to keep developers in mind. So that's great to hear you've had the same experience. Um, cool. Well, let's keep going to your experience maintaining Sobelow. So, for anyone who doesn't know what Sobelow is, maybe folks on this call do know already. But Sobelow was originally started by NCC Group. Keep me honest, Olden, 7 years ago, 8 years ago. Is that right?
it's been around for a little bit. Yeah.
A little bit, yeah. Okay. And so it's an open source security focused static analysis tool that focuses on Elixir and the Phoenix framework specifically. And Holden has been the sole maintainer there for over a year now, working on maintaining the project. I think if you're familiar with Elixir, at least in my circles, the name Sobelow often comes up right alongside it. They've become pretty ubiquitous and they kind of travel together in pairs. So yeah, we're really excited to have you talk about your experience as the maintainer and kind of your involvement in the Elixir community overall. So I guess my first question for you is what initially motivated you to contribute? You mentioned Podium and like they were really bought into Elixir, but how did you move from being a contributor to ultimately becoming the sole maintainer for the Sobelow project?
Yeah, I think that as you sort of mentioned, that it's hard to kind of throw a rock and not see the word so below when you're looking at like Elixir security, especially
Yeah.
a couple of years ago. And so We used Sobelow like when I first started at Podium, which at this point is about 5 years ago, and so like it was we were using it for a while. I was pretty familiar with it, and I was also familiar with the fact like NCC Group. I was an intern there many years ago, and so I was like, all right, cool, like an NCC Group project, right? And
Yeah.
so I was pretty involved from that perspective. But then, like I noticed after time, Griffin, who was the original author of the tool, he had since left NCC Group, and I think him and I have chatted since, and basically like his interests started to shift and other things, life and whatnot, and
Yeah.
basically it was just not getting the attention it maybe it needed, and so I just kind of reached out and I was like, hey, like I'm happy to help. I have a vested interest in it because of my company, but also like I really want to give back and that kind of thing. So that's really how I got involved, and it's been honestly it's been a pleasure. It's been an honor, and yeah, it's been really cool to like learn that kind of that sort of responsibility of like building and working on something that a lot of folks use and depend on. So that's
Yeah.
it's an honor. So
Absolutely. And I think that's so what you described of that transition, I think is to me the most special part of the open source community is like things happen, like life happens, things change, new maintainers come in. But I think that's like really the like golden part is like a project doesn't necessarily have to end because one person isn't able to maintain it anymore, it can take on a new life, it can take on new ownership. But because it's open source, new people can learn from the history of the previous people who have touched that program and have a community of users who are already excited, opinionated, and like have a lot of excitement around the project. So that's awesome. That's really cool. Um, so I guess also I'm sure there may be folks who are curious about how they can get involved either in Sobelow or in the application security community as a whole. What advice do you have? Like how do you kind of broker that first introduction into the AppSec community?
yeah, I think for a long time I had a different understanding of how big the security community is, and I think
Hmm.
really it's pretty small.
Yeah.
Relatively speaking. I think it can be a little deceiving if you go to events like DEF CON where there's like 30,000 people, like hackers running around. But compared to the rest of the tech industry, right? Like we are still sort of the minority in
Yeah.
tech companies, which is okay. It makes sense. But even the most cutting edge security programs within like tech companies have ratios of like maybe 10 to 1 kind of thing, and
Yeah.
if that. And so it's a lot of work, but I that's all to say, we tend to find each other, and I think there are little sub communities everywhere.
Yeah.
And I think there's a ton of opportunity there to get involved. I think there's if you want to contribute, you can pretty easily like almost everything is built on open source all the way down. And so being able to like go to the things you're familiar with or aware of and looking through GitHub issues and looking for that, good first PR like tag is great. But also like, I don't know, you don't have to contribute if you don't want to, if you don't want to, if you just want to be involved instead. Like I think there's local meetups usually, whether it's like OWASP or just other security minded,
Yeah.
hacker groups or something. But then, also there's online resources. There's capture the flag events. There's Discords. There's Slack servers, right? Where people are just pretty welcoming and happy to chat. So
Yeah, I would second that the security community is very small, a lot smaller than I thought. And I think that's a great thing though, because like you said, people are genuinely pretty welcoming. Like it's, people know each other. And I think they have a lot of empathy for people who are new coming into the industry. At least that was my experience. And so I think there are a lot of people who are willing to help. Open source communities are a great spot. Discords are a great spot to try to to try to meet new people and to yeah, just get more involved. So that's great. Um, all right. Well, here's the big announcement. It's time for the big reveal. I'll talk about this briefly, but so we can announce today, Semgrep has new Elixir coverage written by Holden himself. It's a suite of new Semgrep Elixir rules. They cover a bunch of really common security vulnerabilities, SQL injections, command injections, path traversals, just to name a few. There's a lot more rules that he's written, and they're all available today to try. You can run this command here locally, semgrep login, use p/elixir, which is our Elixir rules, and you can run that and start to see it on any of your projects if you want to start playing with it. Holden, anything to add on what you've been working on?
Yeah, I think that the largest thing, obviously, to kind of mention, especially for folks in the community, is that I was able to sort of introduce parity across Sobelow and Semgrep, and you know, I think I've had a few questions privately about like, oh, well, what are some of the motivations there? And like, honestly, I think that the more tool diversity we have, like the more options folk have, like the more secure we can make, our environments and such. So I think it's really important to have tooling that supports whatever path you want to go down. And I think that having both options is like fantastic. And I've previously stated my support and reasoning for wanting to use Semgrep, and we used Sobelow at the same time. I think it's pretty lightweight, so it's like I don't think it hurts. As long as your flow can support it, kind of thing. No, I think it's really important that the rules that we've created are feature parity to Sobelow, so you can trust that they are equivalent, and they work very similarly under the hood. So we feel pretty confident in their detection capabilities. So
Yeah, incredible. Yeah, this has been the work of multiple months of research, learning it probably more about Semgrep than you ever wanted to know, Holden, the inner workings of what we do. So it's been a huge labor of love that is super impressive to have watched. I guess more questions about your development process. You mentioned the big announcement is parity with Sobelow, which is huge, but tell me more about the research process. Like, what did you go through to prioritize the rules that you wanted to write? How did you decide that was the right goal? And you mentioned the parity is the thing you decided on. But yeah, just tell me more about what that research process looked like.
yeah, I think that I guess taking a step back a little bit too, like when I first
Yeah.
came on to maintaining Sobelow, right? Like all of the rules had been written, and I was taking on. I did a lot of I did some cleanup for the code. I had some documentation stuff, and that was great to like familiarize myself with the code and how it worked and stuff. So, when this opportunity came up, it was like, yeah, they worked like similarly under the hood in terms of their approach to recognizing patterns and such. And so I was like, I felt confident we could get to that feature parity. Um, and so I think really when it came time to writing these rules, right, I was able to really sit down and figure out like where could rules be potentially optimized, what was missing from Sobelow rules in little ways, how could we um, merge similar rules because of the flexibility that Semgrep syntax allows us essentially. There are a handful of rules. If For anybody who like looks at the count essentially of rules in Sobelow as compared to Semgrep, there are fewer Semgrep rules, but that's just because we're able to merge some uh, from Sobelow. So I think that was really eye opening, and I think that was really neat. But yeah, as far as like prioritizing which ones, like I obviously wanted to focus on ones that deliver the most value. And Sobelow from its core always approaches it from a hey, we're going to be a little bit more noisy and require a little bit more from either the security team or the developers to sort of take action to make sure, because there are some limitations regarding understanding if like malicious input is being passed to a vulnerable function or something, to really understand if it's actually vulnerable. But with SemGrep, we are able to add a little bit more actionability to some of that, and sort of reduce the count of false positives, which I think is pretty exciting. So it was a nice little shift when I was evaluating the rules to bring over. It's just like, is this rule more valuable now that we can feel a little bit more confident in its whether it's a false positive or not. So
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's great. I always tell folks like when you're evaluating any tool, the raw rule count can be totally arbitrary. Like you can write a rule that's pretty poor and it'll like catch very few things, and the same you can write one really complex rule can catch a lot of things. And so I think that's a good thing for folks to keep in mind. That's a great point. And in addition, I think it's great that you were able to like harness some of SemGrep's additional features to try to tweak some of the rule coverage that you have, and get the false positive count down. That's amazing to see. Um, Great. And then more getting into the SemGrep rule writing process, I feel like you dove headfirst into writing SemGrep rules, getting used to our syntax. Um, What was that process like? How was it like writing a lot of Semgrep rules for the first time? Um, and any tips also for someone who may hear this and is now like, I want to add my own rules. I have my own checks. I want to write more Semgrep rules that I want to add coverage for. How would you recommend they go about getting started?
Yeah, I think that yeah, it really started as like a snowball. I think like it was a little slower at first, getting used to some of the quirks, and then like once I had a good base of like, okay, well, I understand how to do this pattern, and I just want to like slightly tweak it to do something else. It really helped to just kind of build up, to the point where like, yeah, I was able to like kind of spit them out pretty quickly, and I think that's really important. I wish that I would have started dabbling in the playground environment a little sooner.
Mm,
I
yeah.
think there was a good week or so where I was like, no, it's fine. I'll just do local testing. And I ran into a lot of like, weird issues, just like edge case issues that I didn't really like realize. And if I would have just put in the playground, it would have said right there. So
Yeah.
I think that's an invaluable resource. And I think anybody who's looking to write, their own rules for Elixir or just in general, like being able to look at other pre-existing rules that do something similar to what you're trying to do, I think like is incredibly valuable. I think I can't sort of overstate like the beauty of being able to write a generic rule in Semgrep that you just can't really do in a lot of other tools, for to apply to a lot of languages, right? And so being able to like really approach it from a similar perspective is like a different rule. Like I think there was, for instance, there was a rule in Ruby that I was able to like kind of bring over and be like, okay, I'm gonna approach it and structure it kind of similar to this. And so I think
Yeah.
that's super important.
Yeah, that's great. I think, yeah, the playground, in case anyone isn't familiar, the playground is like our web interface. So to help you write rules, and it's kind of like our GUI, I guess you could call it, to help provide some structure around rule writing. Um, but I think that's great. I think for me too, in my experience writing rules, I think borrowing from the community, now you've got a whole suite of Elixir rules to go off of, which makes that even easier. But also like looking at any language, if you have a SQL injection that you want to write in Elixir, for example, looking at other languages to see what can be similar, that can be a great place to help you get started to figure out where you want to go as you're writing your own rule. So I think that's really good advice. And lastly, but maybe what the question that I'm most curious about, what would you want to add? Like if you have someone who's wants to add more support here or just for yourself, what would you want to see next with SemGrep's Elixir coverage?
Yeah, I think that uh, like increasing support in as far as like uh, taint mode and taint analysis, like
Yeah.
we'll just move the rules that already exist to another level, and really being able to ensure that they are true positives and things like that. I know it's a hard problem. I think um, I was talking about it in a GitHub issue on Sobelow actually, that like kind of having taint analysis is kind of like the end goal for a lot of SAST tools, and so
Yep.
um, it's a hard thing to crack, but I think that'll make everything uh, even better than it is already. And but past that, I think there is a lot of opportunity for the community to start to create more rules, or maybe I'll just jump back in and start cranking them out too. Like you know, the nerves framework is already pretty secure by default. They do a lot of cool stuff regarding opt-in, but it would be good to have warnings if folks have unintentionally enabled some of the insecure settings before pushing to
Yep.
production and such. Same with Livebook. I think there's a couple settings there, very minor, but it's still there. And then I think over time we'll start to see more and more rules around misconfigurations and insecurities in common libraries that the community is sort of centered around. I feel like I find a new library every day where I'm like, oh, I could probably build a check for this or a rule for this, and I think it's with the YAML rules. I think it's just easy to just kind of crank them out. So I think we'll start to see more and more.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think that data flow analysis like, is really the key to get some of the more complex vulnerabilities down well. So yeah, I'm very excited for us to continue to invest in that. Yeah, and like you mentioned, I think there's more and more libraries. I mean, Elixir as a language seems to be innovating at an absolutely rapid pace. I mean, we were talking about at the beginning like rapid innovation, and as a language, it's doing a lot of really great, cool things. So I think that's been great to see. And so I think Semgrep's going to have a good challenge to keep up with that and try to continue to add our coverage for all the new libraries and ways that people want to use the language. Fantastic. Well, that is the end of our questions for this fireside chat today. Thanks to everyone who came.